And thank you, everyone. I think it's now time to move to the next set of our presentations. There are several comments here, and yeah, I can see that we really need to have a lot of discussions about all these topics. And but then I would like to now introduce the next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Jermelina Tupas. Let me just open the slide of Dr. Tupas. So we are fortunate to have Dr. Jermelina Tupas with us. Dr. Tupas will provide us a picture of STEM in higher education and the federal landscape for Filipino-Americans. She is the Deputy Division Director of the Division of Human Resource Development, Directorate for Education and Human Resources at the National Science Foundation. Do you see her slide now?
No.
No, not yet. Okay, let me just share screen. Okay, so she's the, as I said, Deputy Division Director of the Division of Human Resource Development, Directorate for Education and Human Resources at the National Science Foundation. She is currently on detail at the National Institutes of Health, Office of the Director. Dr. Tupas has given numerous presentations in national and international conferences or workshops, such as the PAASE's annual meeting and symposium, Society for Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science, Technical Assistance Workshop for the Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander Serving Institutions, and the International Indigenous Research Conference. As an Embassy Science Fellow for the U.S. Department of State, she served as a consultant to the Department of Science and Technology, Philippines, as they built on their K-12 STEM curriculum. Prior to joining the federal government, Dr. Tupas was a faculty member at the University of Hawaii in Manoa. Dr. Tupas?
Thank you, Dr. Santo Domingo, for that introduction and for organizing this panel. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I hope that covers everyone. And before I start, I would like to have some disclaimer. I would like to state that this presentation may not include all relevant facts or the most up-to-date research, and that the opinions expressed in this presentation is my own and not necessarily that of the National Science Foundation. So I also would like to thank Dr. Santo Domingo for controlling my slides. So I'll have the next slide with a little background on the coordination of federal STEM education programs among federal agencies within the executive branch. So as you can see, at the head of this enterprise is the President of the United States, and the worker bees are the representatives of the 14 federal agencies who come together under the Subcommittee on Federal STEM Education Coordination, or FC-STEM. FC-STEM is directed by the Committee on STEM Education, or simply COSTEM, which is composed of the heads of these agencies, and in turn are guided by the National Science and Technology Council, which in turn reports to the Office of Science and Technology Policy, or OSTP. OSTP provides advice and guidance to the presidents on matters concerning STEM education. So in the next slide, I would like to show you the list of these 14 federal agencies, but I'm not going to define the acronyms, but simply point you to the fact that over the years, you could see that the budget for STEM education hovers around 3 billion. And in fact, the last 4 years, there's been a reduction in this budget. And also take note that I highlighted the three agencies that have the top dollars in terms of STEM education. And basically, that's the National Science Foundation, the Department of Education, and the Department of Health and Human Services. And in the next slide, you will see how the pie is divided in FY 2011. And you can still see that the National Science Foundation leads the pack, followed by the Department of Health and Human Services, and then the Department of Education. So the rest of the 14 agencies have this little uh, budget that they have over a period of time. So I want you to know that the National Science Foundation is actually an independent agency. It doesn't fall under a department, whereas the National Institutes of Health is actually part of the Department of Health and Human Services. So to summarize, you could see that these are the three top agencies with big budgets in STEM education. The budget has been flat, and the focus has always been on STEM careers. And although there are a lot of programs that support underrepresented groups, you definitely cannot easily decipher how much is actually spent on diversity and inclusion. So that's one of the problems that we have when we talk about underrepresentation. As you may know, Congress authorized new programs even without appropriation. And the implementers of these programs are, of course, the federal agencies. However, many STEM programs that Congress established not necessarily are being implemented. For this particular administration, the current focus is on skilled STEM workforce. So that means that supporting vocational technical programs at higher high school level or undergraduate levels, particularly at the community colleges. So when I go through this talk, I have a little question is what's lacking? I really want you to focus on what's lacking in this landscape. So in the next slide, you will see the first inventory of STEM education programs conducted in 2010, and it showed most of the budget that went to building STEM degrees and careers, which supported mostly undergraduate and graduate students. And if you include emphasis on improving the learning and learning environments, as well as student engagement, aimed at ensuring persistence and retention in STEM programs, the total budget will be more than two-thirds of the 3 billion. Thus, in fact, and maybe in hindsight, only a small portion is spent on university faculty. This is not for their research, but for their professional development and for pedagogical training. In the next slide, uh, next slide, please. Okay, did I just, okay, sorry. I thought I just lost my power. Okay, so in 2013, FC STEM released its first 5-year strategic plan for STEM education and the second one in 2018. Note that both plans have one of their goals to increase diversity in STEM. In the 2013 to 2018 plan, the focus is on diversity in students, while the 2018 to 2022, it is for all in diversity for all of the Americas. But the common theme here, and I had highlighted it in yellow, is really to focus on historically underrepresented and underserved students in STEM fields for employment. Now, in federal speak, that means African Americans, Native Americans, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and Hispanics. With the 2018 to 2022 plan, there's also an increased focus on underserved groups. So this translates to looking at underrepresentation at the intersections of race, ethnicity, with gender, disability, socioeconomic, and veteran status. So in the next slide, as I said, the focus of the current administration is on students and building a skilled STEM workforce. So a huge amount of money was given to programs that support community colleges to train students for technical degrees or credentials so they graduate faster and can quickly join the STEM workforce. This focus also ensures increasing the participation of groups underrepresented in STEM because many of those enrolled at community colleges are from underrepresented or underserved backgrounds. While this is a great opportunity for underrepresented students, it may also support a STEM status quo of the dominance of white or Caucasian group in STEM. Of course, I'm not going to go into that because that's another rabbit hole, but I would like to emphasize that the federal government continues its efforts on building capacity in in STEM human resources by supporting historically or traditionally underrepresented minorities through programs that support the institutions where these groups are enrolled. For example, historically black colleges and universities, and then you have the tribal colleges and universities, Alaska Native serving institutions, Native Hawaiian serving institutions, and the Hispanic serving institutions. So, an emerging group that was created by Act of Congress in 2007 directed the Department of Education to support Asian American Pacific Islanders through the ANAPISI, or Asian American Native American Pacific Islanders program. So, Filipino Americans are considered to belong to this group. But before I go further into the discussion of the AAPIs, I would like to digress a little to point out that there are very few programs that look at the extremely important component of higher education, the faculty. Yes, this is the gap that I was referring to, the missing element in the landscape because of the emphasis on students. Institutions of higher education have already very diverse student body, and as the US demographics continue to change, following a prediction that by 2060, the minority population will be the majority and the white or Caucasian group will fall to less than 40%. It is therefore expected that student diversity will continue to increase from the current 55% level. However, in STEM, the student population is still largely homogeneous, and so is the faculty. Diversity at the faculty level, particularly in STEM fields, will continue to lag. This has various implications in the success in STEM of underrepresented groups. This was also touched briefly by the first group, that the lack of role model does not encourage people of color to pursue STEM degrees, and this is also a not so subtle reminder of the racial divide. This means that there are very few faculty who can relate and understand the implications of the multicultural aspects of learning exhibited by underrepresented minorities, and therefore they cannot provide the cultural relevance of the courses they teach. And sometimes this also causes resentment among faculty that may even be exhibited or translated into racism or discrimination, and that could exacerbate the experiences of students already impacted by stereotype threats. Finally, with no inspiration for underrepresented minorities, they will not aspire to be in the academy, thereby an aging academic enterprise may continue to lose potential excellent faculty. I applaud PAASE for their achievements and in sharing with the Philippines their science and technology expertise. But one potential way that this can go further is to support the next generation of scientists and engineers. And that could be not only to mentor students, but also early career scientists, investigators from underrepresented groups, particularly the Philippine Americans, so they too will aspire to remain in the academy. Now, back to the Asian American Pacific Islanders. Here's a question for you. What prevents agencies with large STEM education budget, such as NSF, from supporting NAPCs? So, as I mentioned earlier, many of the programs that support underrepresented groups were established through congressional authorization. However, not all agencies are easily persuaded to do so if the authorization does not come with budget appropriation. For example, NSF was authorized to establish an HSI program in 2007, but it took another 10 years for the agency to finally establish the program. NSF argued that the agency was already supporting a lot of HSIs, although this may be just the major ones that have high research or PhD granting institutions, such as the University of California system. And therefore, NSF argued that it doesn't need to establish the HSI program. So it took a lot of advocacy from the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities, as well as congressional arm wrestling for NSF to finally establish the HSI program in 2017. Now it is one of the largest under represented minority programs at NSF. So in the next slide, if you look into educational achievements of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, I have put here arrows on the Asians. Indeed, it seems like the picture of a high level achievement of Asian Americans in STEM, where they excel in obtaining doctorates in STEM fields. And this further supports the assertion that Asian Americans are not underrepresented in STEM. Note, however, that this is an aggregate of Asian American groups, and maybe you can guess which ethnic group is really representing that high level. However, data like this do not support the need for more funds to go to ANAPISIs. And of course, this data is from the National Science Foundation National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics. So figure that one out. So in the next slide, the academic dominance of Asian Americans is also evident in their overall baccalaureate degree completion. This is very apparent, especially in the 4-year graduation rate. Now, this data is from the Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics, but this type of data, as well as the one I showed earlier, and we can find more, does suggest that Asian Americans are doing well academically, including in STEM fields, thus fueling the model minority myth, or I would say threat. Again, please note that these are aggregated data, but has been used by many federal agencies to argue that Asian Americans are overrepresented in STEM, which does not help the cause of Filipino Americans as well as other Southeast Asian Americans. So in the next slide, when disaggregating data on the Asian Americans, we could see that in terms of population size, the largest groups are the Asian Indians, followed by Chinese, then Filipino Americans. So it may appear that this is a similar pattern for achievements in STEM, where Filipino Americans are doing just as well as the South and East Asian Americans. So the disaggregated data on the table at the right shows the educational levels of Asian Americans, and mostly above the national level, as I have highlighted in green, and the Filipino group in yellow, and very few actually are below the national level, those highlighted in turquoise. So educational achievements, as shown by the aggregated data, as well as this disaggregated table, demonstrates that Asian or most Asian Americans are super achievers, not requiring special programs for recruitment and retention efforts, thereby supporting the model minority myth. However, I believe this is a double edged sword because Asian Americans face limitations in opportunities based on the assumption of their overrepresentation. This is especially true for underrepresented Asian American ethnic groups, including second generation Phil Americans who are underrepresented in STEM, and yet they remain invisible and are unable to take advantage of opportunities afforded to traditionally underrepresented minorities because of these types of information. So in the next slide, I want you to see how some of those information actually classify Filipinos. It appears that some of them classify them as their own subgroup. And there's only one ethnicity, of course, Filipinos. But on the disaggregated data that we have shown in this on the right side, you could also see that the Filipino Americans have earned bachelor's degrees at the same level as the Chinese and Japanese Americans. So some studies correlate high academic achievements with this to socioeconomic advantage. In fact, among Asian Americans, the Filipino Americans has the lowest poverty level. Thus, this academic achievement appears to extend to STEM degrees. This is another complex issue, and you have heard why, where Filipino Americans have been shown to earn STEM degrees as well as other dominant Asian groups. So, what many of the data omit is that these represent first generation, highly professional Filipino immigrants. But this may not be true for US born or second generation Filipino Americans. So, lastly, I was going to say that many studies are now advocating the use of disaggregated data to paint the real picture of the underrepresentation of Asian Americans in STEM, particularly Southeast Asians. So there is hope. There is hope if only we can reflect this diversity also at the federal level. So I leave you with the last slide with the following questions on how we can help second generation Filipino Americans. Why do they struggle more than the first generation Filipino Americans? And how do they fit in the descriptors of Asian Americans? So I have some of these suggested readings if you would like to and have time to do so. Enjoy the reading on how some of these issues came about. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tupas. So we can see how really complicated, this landscape is for Filipino Americans.